They say every generation inherits a story, some wrapped in glory, some wrapped in shame, and some wrapped in a silence so heavy that even the wind hesitates to speak it. But there are stories that refuse to stay buried, stories that push through the cracked earth of history like a root seeking daylight. And today, I stand before you to speak of a man whose name barely made it onto the pages of the world, yet whose shadow stretched far beyond the walls of the plantation that tried to contain him. A man whispered about in fear, in awe, and sometimes in trembling respect. A man named Mose Jackson. Most people have never heard of him. That's how history works. It records the names of the powerful and forgets the names of the oppressed, unless those oppressed refused to bow. Mose Jackson was one of those who refused. He was born into a world that shackled his hands but could not chain his mind, a world that broke bones but could not break spirit, a world that forced human beings to bake bread when what they really wanted was justice. Those 9 loaves of bread he baked every day weren't just food. They were symbols of the cruel routine forced upon him by 9 different masters. 9 men who believed that ownership meant dominion, that domination meant mastery, and that mastery meant control. But what do you do with a man whose spirit you cannot control? What do you do with a man who wakes up each morning, steps into the heat of fire meant to dominate him, and instead learns to bend that fire to his will? What do you do with a man who becomes stronger in the very furnace meant to weaken him? You fear him, and that is why Mose Jackson was called the most feared slave. Not because he lifted a hand against his masters, though the stories say he certainly could have. Not because he plotted revenge, though the legends say he had every right to. Not because he spread rebellion, though his very existence was rebellion enough. He was feared because he shattered the illusion that slavery could crush every man it touched. His strength became a threat, his endurance, a warning, his refusal to break, a sermon before there was a preacher. Picture this: a man rising before the dawn, before roosters crowed, before his overseers even opened their eyes. A man standing in front of a fire that roared like the very rage he carried in his chest. A man kneading dough with hands that had tasted the sting of the whip but never surrendered their power. A man who baked bread not out of love, not out of duty, but out of force. 9 loaves for 9 men who owned his body but not his destiny. They demanded bread, but what they received every day was a reminder that the one they oppressed might be the one God had fortified. And while he baked, those masters feared the very sound of his footsteps. They whispered about his strength. They feared his silence. They feared the fire in his eyes. They feared the possibility that one day he might refuse to bake, refuse to bow, refuse to submit. They feared that he might rise in the way oppressed people have risen since the dawn of oppression, not always with violence, but with dignity so sharp it cuts the chains applied to their wrists. So I want you to imagine the weight of a man who was forced to produce for the men who sought to erase him. Imagine the irony of a man creating bread, a symbol of nourishment, while he himself was starved of freedom. Imagine the contradiction of 9 masters feeding their families with the sweat of a man they treated as less than human. And yet, he kept rising. Rising before the sun, rising through his pain, rising in ways the world did not expect and the oppressors could not comprehend. There is a certain holiness in endurance. Not the kind of endurance that accepts injustice, but the kind that survives long enough to defy it. The kind that says, "You may press me, but you will not erase me." Mose Jackson embodied that, and whether the world remembers him or not, whether the history books give him a single sentence or a single line, the legacy of who he was still preaches today. He was not a man who waited for applause. He was not a man who needed an audience. His life itself was a testimony, written not on pages, but on scars, not on parchment, but on sweat-soaked earth. And I want you to hear this today. Strength wrapped in suffering becomes a threat to every system built on control. That is why oppressed people throughout time have been feared. Because somewhere deep within them, no matter what chains are applied, the image of God refuses to be extinguished. That divine spark terrifies the oppressor. It terrified the men who claimed to own Mose Jackson. For every loaf he baked reminded them that they depended on the one they despised. They needed the hands they whipped. They needed the strength they hated. They needed the man they feared. Isn't it strange how the oppressed have always fed the oppressor? Isn't it strange how the very people pushed to the bottom have held entire civilizations on their backs? Isn't it strange how those considered property built the wealth of those who claimed to own them? That is why the story of Mose Jackson still matters. Because it is not just the story of a man forced to bake bread, it is the story of a people forced to build nations, economies, cultures, and legacies while being denied their own. Yet through it all, the spirit rises. Through it all, the fire burns. Through it all, God strengthens the hands of those who the world tries to weaken. And just like the Israelites in Egypt, just like the Hebrews crying out under Pharaoh, just like every oppressed people through time, the cry is always the same: how long? How long will the powerful abuse the weak? How long will the suffering go unnoticed? How long will humanity allow injustice to masquerade as order? The story of Mose Jackson forces us to confront these questions because it forces us to confront ourselves. It asks us what we do when we see injustice. It asks us whether we resemble the slave who endured or the masters who oppressed. It asks us if we build chains or break them. It asks us if we demand bread from those already burdened or if we help lighten their load. It asks us whether we live with fear-based control or courage-based compassion. And it also reminds us that God often hides his greatest warriors in the most unexpected places. Not on thrones, but in kitchens. Not in palaces, but in fields. Not among the privileged, but among the oppressed. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it kneads dough in silence while the world looks away. That's why the story of Mose Jackson is more than a tale of fear. It is a warning to those who exploit, a comfort to those who suffer, and a call to those who dare to resist injustice. His life says, "Even when you think you have stripped me of everything, I still hold the one thing you cannot take, my will." And when a person's will remains intact, they can outlast systems, outlast oppression, outlast cruelty, and sometimes even outlast the memory of their captors. So today, I invite you to listen, not just with your ears, but with your conscience. Listen to the footsteps of a man walking into a furnace he did not choose. Listen to the crackle of fire that was meant to burn him but instead refined him. Listen to the kneading of dough that became the rhythm of resistance. And listen to the whispers of 9 men who feared the very man they tried to diminish. Because in the end, this is not just the story of Mose Jackson. It is the story of every person who has ever been pushed down but refused to stay down. It is the story of every soul who has ever been chained but still found a way to rise. It is the story of every heart that chose endurance over surrender, dignity over despair, and strength over silence. And if you listen closely, his story still speaks. Not from history books, not from monuments, not from the lips of the powerful, but from the fire of endurance that burns in every human spirit determined to survive.